Good morning, everyone. As you can see, my name is Mark Laity. I'm now the director of the Stratcom Academy and formerly the director of communications at Shape. And it's a pleasure to be here to kick off the morning session. And I'll be starting a presentation now. So, hoping everyone can see that, then let's get going. What we're talking about in this session is hybrid. As everyone knows, I'm a strategic communicator, and strategic communications is one of the key elements of hybrid, whatever term you use. So let's give you a quote to start with. The gentleman at the bottom is not only the leading, the head of the armed forces for the United Kingdom, but he's someone with a huge amount of experience on operations, off operations, and is one of the leading thinkers about the world we live in now. And I think if you look at the quote that's on the screen, the emphasis he puts on narrative. So within the context of constant competition, he's saying success is defined by the triumph of the narrative. And I think it's a very striking quote. War is a theater and you're a producer of a spectacle. NATO has been gripping hybrid and putting it in the context of Stratcom really ever since the Russian aggression in Ukraine. So the quotes you see on the screen, you see the Wales Summit Declaration, hybrid warfare need to be answered by enhancing Stratcom. And then you see Jens Stoltenberg highlighting, if you like, the key point about hybrid, which is to be below the threshold of a major war. But that is a kind of war in itself, aggressive actions below Article 5. Now, of course, NATO is still very much in the deterrence business. People often talk about the credibility, the ability to... Geoffrey, I'm getting a lot of interference. If there is a problem there, let me know, otherwise I'm going to keep going. It's the triad for deterrence. Everyone knows else. The voice has gone down a little bit. I'm sorry about this, people. But you're probably hearing what I'm there. Okay, the noise is now gone. It's now started again. Okay, I will continue. The last point I was making about the triad. Everyone understands in deterrence the ability to fight, the willingness to fight. But of course, if the enemy doesn't know you have the ability and the willingness, then you're not deterring. So communication is essential to deterrence as capability and willingness. There's nothing new about hybrid in many respects. It's a term that we've used, but the Cold War was in many respects a hybrid conflict. And the very first SAC year, General Eisenhower, I think was an extremely effective strategic communicator. He called it psychological warfare. And this is a man who led the biggest military action, the biggest military alliance the world has ever seen. And he got to the essence of it when he highlighted that everything we say, everything we do will have its impact. So strategic communication is not public affairs on steroids. It's about communicating in everything we say and do. And as he highlights, everything we fail to say or do. Now, we've adopted that, and the quote that you see for NATO at the bottom comes from one of the key documents of NATO. And it highlights information strategy has to be integrated. It's at the heart of policy planning and implementation, and then integrated to achieve the effects we need to forward the alliance. So here is the agenda that we're going to look at. And we'll start obviously with hybrid. Many of you may have seen this slide before. It's quite well known. It's called the Garasamus Slide. And it is the Russian view of how war will be fought. Not how the Russians fight war specifically, it's how they think war will be fought, which obviously includes them. So you'll see General Garasamus, the chief of the Russian General Staff, highlights phases of conflict, and on the left, it's covert, so it's happening, whether we know it or not. And then it escalates through the crisis, then you have your fight, and then somebody wins. What's interesting, and what I want people to look at, is that the non-military in blue and the military in gray, there's only one thing that goes from the beginning to the end and straddles both non-military and military. And that's what the Russians call information confrontation. Now, that is their version of StratCom. It's not the same. It's much more expansive, more kinetic, more military, but it's as close as we get to StratCom, information confrontation. And you can see how important it is to them. And it's all about preparation. So Sun Tzu, the great thinker, great military thinker, highlights that you don't go to war unless you've planned. You win before you go to war. You get your ducks in a row. And for Gerasimov and the Russians, information dominance is key. So this is a quote from him in 2017. And notice the bit in red, please. Achieving information dominance is an indispensable prerequisite for combat actions. Not advantage, dominance, and not nice to have, but indispensable. And you've got to win that before you can go into combat. Now, that combat could be a short war, it could be a long war, or maybe you can win without going to war altogether. And I think that we should assume that the adversaries that NATO and the countries that support NATO have is one where our adversaries would like to win, to achieve their objectives without a war, because war is uncertain and costly, whether you win or whether you lose. So you can see the emphasis the Russians are putting on information as an element of hybrid, indispensable. And this is kind of reflected in the way that we see hybrid conflict conducted now. So what are the paths to power short of an actual war of the traditional kind? So the image you can see is a logo for one of the Russian cyber actors, Fancy Bear. And there's three elements: information, which we're talking about, cyber, which can be technical and psychological. You can, if you like, use it as a tool for passing on your misinformation, your disinformation, but you can also use it to achieve actual effects such as shutting power grids, and also their intelligence agencies. Now, Russian intelligence agencies are much more active than most nations' intelligence agencies. Most NATO nations primarily use their intelligence agencies as spying to gather information. For the Russians, the GRU, FSB, and so on are actors. They act, they do a lot. Space and electronic warfare are now another path to war, a path to power. A lot of hybrid activity is deniable. Our ability to pass information, to control ourselves, is critically dependent on things like GPS space. If the Russians, or Chinese for that matter, can interfere in space in a deniable manner, they give themselves an incredible amount of advantage. And we're already seeing some of the things that are happening is that space is becoming a hybrid battleground. And one of the things that we would see is for leverage, an adversary would interfere with our space communications and deny it. And it's very hard to prove that it's true. Special forces are now a key element of hybrid. They're not the only people who use them. The Americans have often used special forces, for instance. But deniable special forces, such as the Wagner Group, you're seeing the Russians using special forces as advisors, actors, players in places like Africa, and they're always deniable. And then finally, economic. Economic is not just things like sanctions or the Russian use, say, of gas supplies in Ukraine. It is economic corruption. And you'll see this in particular with the Chinese. It's much cheaper to buy a country or buy its leadership than is to develop a country. And you're seeing this happening with the Russians and the Chinese. The Chinese Belt and Road Initiative is both soft power, but also a weapon of hybrid power because it gets people into debt traps. So all of these elements achieve enormous things. But the Russians, I think, have also given us some lessons on one of the key elements of obtaining power, which is narrative to persuade. And we'll talk more about narrative in a little bit. This is a statue of Prince Vladimir of Kiev in a square next to the Kremlin, and a speech that President Putin gave on why Prince Vladimir should be near the Kremlin and why he mattered. And what you see there is they use Prince Vladimir, who's an incredibly important figure in the Slavic history. He is the person who pushed the Slavic nations down the Orthodox route. He is the person who pulled together the countries through persuasion and conquering. He's incredibly important to the Ukrainians. He's actually very important to anyone who is of the Orthodox religion. And what the Russians have done is they've tried to take him and make him a tool of the Russian narrative. And you can see from what Putin is saying there, he is saying Vladimir, who everybody in the Orthodox world, the Slavic world, reveres, was a defender of Russian lands, not Slavic lands, who united all of the people across the Slavic world into one. And then he says, our duty today, in other words, Russia's duty, is to do the same. In other words, to control the near abroad, if you like, to create a Soviet Union light. So he is using the history and the narrative of the Slavic world to justify Russians' strategy. And their use of history is very, very much aligned to how they want to achieve their strategic aims. So the hybrid conflict in Ukraine, what they did was they took the history, the Ukrainian fight, the Crimean fight against the Nazis in World War II. They then said that Ukrainian government, the Kiev government, was in effect Nazis. They gave people, using a classic marketing trick, a binary choice. They said to Crimeans in their referendum on unification with Russia, what do you want to be? Do you want to be a Nazi or do you want to be a Russian? Do you want to be Kiev, Nazis, or do you want to be Russians, which is not much of a choice? And they do this by tapping into contemporary viewpoints as well. So we live in a world, and you're all much younger than me, and you're all very much more aware of these modern events, where trust in establishments, trust in governments is lacking. And a lot of it dates from the Iraq conflict and the weapons of mass destruction fiasco, and also the financial crisis of 2000, 2008. And Russia today, the Russian propaganda arm, highlights that it tries to promote itself by saying, trust no one, question more. And that's a very important philosophical point as well. If you look at the quote in red, Margarita Simonyan, who is the RT editor-in-chief, has battened on to the distrust of establishment, which has been there a long time, hence the image of the X-Files with its logo, trust no one, and said there's no such thing as objectivity. In other words, everything's a viewpoint. And Hannah Arendt, who some of you will be very well aware of, who was a philosopher of the totalitarian nations, highlights if you can confuse people, if you can make them unsure of what's true and what's false, they become very easy to manipulate. And so this is a profound point that we need to be aware of. If we lose the concept of truth, of a shared set of facts, we become very easy to manipulate. In Arendt's world, we become the ideal subject of totalitarian rule. And when they're caught out, the Russians are very open about this. Margarita Simonyan, again, asked on a Russian internet radio, why does Russia need RT? And there's her answer. It's a weapon, like any other. And going back to this existential nature of the post-truth era, there's two quotes, one from a Republican president and one from a Democratic president of the United States, highlighting governments fail, democracy can't work. So when we talk about the struggle that we're in now, I believe it's existential. So what are the lessons? Well, the first thing is go back to that Garasamus slide. It's happening. It also goes back much further. The nature of trust, credibility, belief in systems. This has been going on since Sun Tzu, since Aristotle. What they are is they're taking the new technology and taking those old principles and they're applying them. So we need to understand what's going on in the world. Understand is critical. We need to make sure that our policies, our strategies, understand the communication effort. We need to align everything because the Russians don't just issue propaganda, they do it with a purpose to support their geographical aims, their geostrategic aims, as do the Chinese. And it's everyone's business. When you're not in a full-blown war, then NATO is not necessarily the lead agency. And it's not just government, it's society. It's me, it's you. And this takes resources and expertise. Nothing comes cheap. And then looking at my thing, real strategic communication, not just whacking out some messages like a press release. So let's now look at narrative. I want to give you a very early example of narrative. Vladimir Putin. The image on the left is of a Russian television series, which was very, very popular when he was growing up. It's called The Shield and the Sword, which is the motto of the KGB. When Putin gave an interview to an American newspaper, it says, why did he join the KGB? And he said, because I love their stories. And he highlights a pure and utterly successful product of Soviet patriotic education. So Putin, in many respects, is Putin because of the narrative that he took. But we're all part of a narrative. Stories have been going since we learned to speak. We're all trying to go from an old story where we were to a new story, where we want to be as individuals, as a society. And also, stories are how we explain the world around us. They're that important. So there you have an image of a classic old-fashioned story telling. But throughout the ages, the storyteller is revered. The painter, the filmmaker. So on the left, that's a classic image of a British painter giving Sir Walter Raleigh, one of the great heroes of British history, one of the great sailors, his love of the sea. And then on the right, Spielberg, who has been so influential in setting the modern American narrative. Stories are what drive us. So why is that? Because sometimes it seems an awful lot to build on a story. How can we rest so much on stories? And the reason is because we always have. There's a concept called behavioral modernity. And as you can see, it's about when did we start organizing ourselves? When did we start planning? When did we become a society? And it's put under the term behavioral modernity. And it evolved over 50 to 150,000 years as we move from individual loincloths and families to much bigger groupings. And then compare it with literacy. 3,000 years ago, 1% of people could read and write and do their numbers. In 1820, it was still only 12%. If you take the UK as an example, in 1500, 10% of men, 1% of women. And then in the red, there's the point. For 47,000 plus years, we developed without literacy or numeracy. And yet we did pretty damn well. We advanced a long way. And the story was the critical way that we passed on our development. When we couldn't read or write, we sat around the fireside and we told each other stories. So the three elements then of successful communication also go back. I've quoted Sun Tzu. Here is Aristotle. Aristotle's rhetoric is the book to read about how you communicate. And he has three elements from which all the rest fall. Logos, pathos, ethos, argument, passion, credibility. The combination of those three is what communicates. A good argument isn't going to cut it. In fact, pathos, passion works more. Ethos, the right to be listened to. A person who is listened to. It's no good having a good story. It's no good having a good argument if people don't think you're credible. And past and present highlight that. Daniel Kahneman, who some of you I'm sure have read his wonderful book, Thinking Fast and Slow, won a Nobel Prize for his understanding of behavioral economics. And as an economist, he highlighted numbers don't make decisions. They need a story. And if you read his books and if you look at behavioral psychology, they all say the same thing. And more militarily, the US counterinsurgency doctrine links narratives with organization. The same pillars, the same essential elements of a narrative can actually form the basis of a plan. And if that seems far-fetched, that's why I put up that technical quote from a US counterinsurgency doctrine, worked out by hard-bitten people who wanted to win wars. So this is what stories and narratives do. So they create that culture. They create the group identity. They help stabilize us and a frame of reference. They reinforce identity and they're persuasive. People like stories. And as the counterinsurgency doctrine says, it's an organizing framework. So stories work either for or against us. And here, I think, is a dramatic example of the story. I'm sure most of you will recognize the two images are from the Hunger Games, a superb series of films, which are actually very heavily focused on strategic communication. If you look at Mockingjay Part 1, then you will see that. The outlying districts are being oppressed by the capital, and they have a symbol, the three-finger salute, and you can see it in both of the images there. Now look at this. And this is present-day Myanmar, where the three-finger salute has become the symbol of resistance. Hunger Games is a story. Myanmar is a reality. And yet, the story, the resonance of the Hunger Games story is so strong that it has become the symbol of resistance in Myanmar. And before that, in Thailand, where the three-finger salute is now outlawed. It's banned. It's illegal. And this isn't just a fancy thing for a demonstration. Look at the image on the left. Those are people who need shields to protect themselves from the Burmese authorities. And on it is painted that three-finger salute. That's what stories do. They inspire, they lead. So let's look a little bit at NATO's approach. Now, I'm no longer in NATO, but, it's easier to leave NATO on retirement than to take NATO out of yourself in terms of your opinions and beliefs and views. Within NATO, I was one of the joint authors of our military policy on STRATCOM. Now, this is a very technical definition that's up there, but I think it's very important because it understands hybrid strategic communications and the way we need to work. We take our communications and we integrate them with other military activities. They're not a standalone function. They don't happen before, they don't happen after, they happen alongside. And then we use that to understand what's going on and then shape to act. So the point of STRATCOM, integrate, understand, shape, to actually do things. It is not an information. This is really hard to do. Easy to say, easy-ish, hard to do. And I want to highlight then the principles of strategic communications in NATO, because I would also say they are the principles of NATO, both in terms of its values and how it works. So NATO's values have to be reflected in everything we say and do. And we'll talk a little bit about our values later. So the first thing you do as a strategic communicator is you live NATO's values. You integrate, as I've explained, your narrative, policy, and strategy. They all have to come together. You have to be credible. Because if you want people to listen to you, if you want people to heed you, if you want people to do what you want them to do, they have to be prepared to say, this person is worth listening to. This person is worth following. And usually that means you've got to align your words and actions. You can't just talk the talk, you must walk the walk. And when you are talking to somebody, know your audience. Because it's no good, put it in very crude terms, it's no good speaking English to a non-English speaking Frenchman or vice versa. Know your audience. Again, collective and integrated. This is whole of government stuff. The world of hybrid is all of us. And then always know what you're trying to achieve. Very often people mean well, but then you ask them what you mean, they can't tell you. And in the hybrid world, in the Stratcom world, we have to be empowered at all levels. In our own ways, we're all communicating. So that brings me, I think, to the point about where does all this lead? I like history. I'm sure many of you do. The Melian Dialogues was something written by Thucydides, who wrote the history of the Peloponnesian War, which is basically the great struggle between the two great powers of Athens and Sparta. Spartans versus the Athenians. Thucydides, in many respects, although this was a war of ancient Greece, many of the philosophical themes are the same. They're unchanged. It's why people read Greek history, it's why they read things like Thucydides. As part of that, he dramatized one of the small incidents within that, which was what happened to a country called Melia, a small country. Think of it like saying one of the Baltics. And it was neutral. It wanted to stay out of this battle between Sparta and Athens. And in the end, the Athenians said, no, you're going to have to join us. You don't have to fight, but we're going to put in a controller. You will become part of us, and in effect, we will control your foreign policy and have a ruler. And the Melians said, hang on, we're neutrals. We don't want to be part of this. We've not interfered. We've not helped Sparta. Just leave us aside. And also, they said, you Athenians, you aspire to democracy. You keep saying that you respect the rights of other nations. Now, what are you doing? And in the dialogues, this became the most famous phrase. As the world goes, right is only in question between equals in power. The strong do what they can, and the weak suffer what they must. In other words, I'm big, you're small, get in line. The classic great power, realist, neo-realist, offensive realist, all of the social things you talk about, one of the things that's been going on is spheres of influence, the great game. It's about big powers using their big muscle to do what they want, while the small guys get in line. And in the end, the Melians got in line. They were conquered because they resisted. And people look at the Melian dialogues in different ways. Some see it as ultimately cynical. Some see it as showing we have to be realistic about the world. The Russians love being the big guy. There was a period after the end of the Cold War when we all said spheres of influence were bad, that let's put them aside, let's ignore them. And then that all got put aside by the Russians. In his Munich speech in 2007, I think it was, Putin highlighted that Russia had always carried out an independent foreign policy in its own way. And if you look at the Russian history, it has always wanted to control the nations around it, what they now call their near abroad. And at the height of their power, what was the Soviet Union? They always regarded, in a very cynical way, that in order to defend Russia, they needed to control Eastern Europe. They have now reverted to that. And so Medvedev, when he was the president, sort of, highlighted that they had privileged interests in regions. And what it meant was the near abroad, what it calls the near abroad. All its neighbors has privileged interests from the Russians, where the Russians have extra rights and those nations don't. So this is never, we're going back to the way the world has so often been. We had the end of the Cold War, we had this brief period of sunlight where maybe we thought we could move on. We haven't, and possibly we can't. And China's in that great game on all fronts. I've not talked about them much. I think NATO needs to work out what it wants to do about China other than worry. But it's in the great game on all fronts, in the hybrid level, at the diplomatic thing. Look at this aggressive diplomacy. It's wolf warrior diplomacy, as it's called. You know, so you arrest one of us, we seize some of your nation as hostages. Hugely aggressive ambassadors now, but also aggressive in the way that it tries to control ethnic Chinese abroad. It's Confucius institutes, which are just propaganda institutes. It's also incredibly aggressive on the information front. The three warfares, which are media warfare, psychological warfare, and legal warfare. A very sophisticated philosophy, which they had developed long before hybrid, and has its roots actually in the Chinese Communist Party of Mao, but is now the official doctrine of the People's Liberation Army, the Chinese army. United Front work, which is a benign sounding phrase for a very covert kind of soft power truism. Speak to Australians, speak to New Zealanders about the way that they use this United Front work to, they call it a magic weapon, to infiltrate other societies. Then on the military side, the South China Sea, which is a combination of aggression and legal warfare, in that they're building artificial islands which have no legal status, but they're asserting their legal status. They're asserting the Chinese control the South China Sea because of historical rights, which are nonsense, but they're asserting that. And then the defense spending to back it, the world's biggest navy. That's huge. They are spending vast sums on defense, outspending nations. The figures they issue are not even close to what they are. Then, of course, economic. Chinese are perfectly entitled to sell abroad, but what you see is the political use of its power. The Belt and Road is not just a way of exporting Chinese goods, it's a way of gaining influence, of controlling. You're buying countries, you're buying influence, you're corrupting. And of course, there's many nations are finding their debt traps. Is the Chinese don't do anything for free, nothing. So that new great game is, of course, the same old great game. Another quote from the Melian Dialogues. The cynicism of the Russian and Chinese is they say, well, we're only doing what everybody does. And that was in the Melian Dialogues as well. The Athenians told the Melians, if you were as powerful as us, you would do the same. If you were as powerful as us, you would do the same as us. And that's reflected in NATO 2030, where we now, you can read the quote, competing great powers. But NATO is different. And here's just from the NATO-Russia Founding Act. The aim, which Russia has set aside, was to create a space of security and stability without dividing lines or spheres of influence, limiting the sovereignty of any state. The nature of NATO is one where we cannot and do not play the old great game. That's where NATO is different, because it's a consensus organization. Frankly, we all know that sometimes it's a pain in the ass for the bigger members of NATO when one of the smaller members of NATO says no. But it makes NATO what it is. It reminds us that we are different. And when you're doing a narrative, it helps to have something simple. And I've always loved this quote from the Norwegian Prime Minister at the time, Erna Solberg. That's what it's about. A simple statement. Very often people say we don't explain ourselves very well, and very often they're right. But there it is in a upsum. We cannot have a world where big countries decide what to do with their neighbors. And there aren't many big countries. Russia, up to a point, it's a big country. Economically, it's not. China, the United States, some regional powers. But most of us are small and medium countries. So unless we band together, basically we're screwed. So we need our strategic narrative to persuade people. And this is taken from our doctrine, one of our directives at NATO. And I think it explains why you need that narrative. Because as Aristotle highlighted, support comes from logic and instinct. If we want support, it must resonate. And then what we do must be consistent, because otherwise we have no credibility. And then we need a simple narrative. And there is the simple narrative as currently written. So when somebody says, what's NATO for? That's what you can say. And what's interesting is that is what NATO's narrative has always been. And this is used in the NATO 2030. So some things never change. And most people don't have time to be very interested in NATO. Most people don't have very much time to be interested in much beyond their normal lives. So if somebody says, well, what's NATO for? That's what we're for. So in terms of the narrative, there are the questions that I would suggest you ask. Now, I know many of you will be students and so on, but you still have a group. You still have a group of people. The fact that you're still listening to me, the fact you're in this forum, shows you're interested. So what is your narrative? Do you understand it? Who are you trying to speak to? And you're in the Spring Forum. We're fighting a war. It's not the normal war, but we're still fighting it. So what are you doing? So I kind of give a checklist for action. And we need to wake up, recognize the world has changed. Some bits never changed. Sun Tzu, Clausewitz, Melian dialogues, but many bits don't, that have changed. So we need to organize for what's happening today. We need to integrate on a much broader area than we ever have before. You need to make sure your communicator is a core player, not an afterthought. Understand what's happening. Educate yourself or others. Think strategically. Don't get tied up in the little stuff. And remember, we need allies everywhere. Most important, though, live your values. And Ed Murrow, perhaps the greatest post-war journalist, an American, encapsulated a lot of what needs to be done. To be persuasive, we must be believable. To be believable, we must be credible. To be credible, we must be truthful. So I'll leave you with what I tend to say show NATO military audiences. The say-do gap must be eliminated. And NATO's doing a lot of that. But it needs to keep doing it and needs to keep doing it better. With that, thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I think now is the time for me to speak.
Yeah, please.
Okay, thank you so much for your presentation. I shall shortly introduce myself. I'm Nina van der Heijde. I'm a second lieutenant at the Dutch Army. I work for the Communication and Engagement Company. And I just started with my first function as a commander of a tactical PSYOPs team. And it's really interesting because I also learned a little bit in my specialist training to become a CNE officer about STRATCOM. And I hear some things coming back. So I think that's a good thing because you tell the same story as the Dutch STRATCOM officers do. And I would like to start with a question myself. Because what we also discussed during our training is the moral high ground, and it's really because you stated really clear that you have to live your values, and NATO has a really clear narrative, and of course values that become with them, but Russia is quite successful in, how do I say it? Yeah, well, their propaganda, and it's like black propaganda, so they lie, and it's really effective. And I'm really curious about your opinion about it, because of course, to be honest, it's really important. And it's really important to NATO, but Russia is really effective too with their strategy. It's quite maybe an ethical question, but I'm really curious about your point of view about it.
Before I answer, I want to say, can people see me, or am I still behind the screen? I just want to make sure I haven't left the presentation on. Okay, good. They can see me. Look, this is a really difficult one. NATO, some NATO nations are frankly not living all of the values that we aspire to. I'm not going to shy away from that. I'm retired now. They can't, my pension's invested, they can't get at it. Some nations are not living up to those values, and I think that's a problem. It's not a killer problem, because the point about NATO is it is not primarily about what happens internally to nations. It's about nations coming together to protect themselves against external threats. Mm-hmm. So, in many respects, I would argue, for instance, that the EU, which does, and I don't mean this pejoratively, does interfere very heavily in internal affairs, would have a bigger problem. NATO's nations are looking to NATO to defend it, not interfere in their internal affairs. So to a degree, we have a get-out clause, and a genuine, legitimate one. But nevertheless, I do think that we are damaged, and I use we because I'm a member of a NATO nation, not just in NATO. We are damaged by some of the nations. But at the same time, what we still can say is we're not interfering in nations. We're not telling these nations to join this club or leave that club or whatever. We're not interfering in that sense, whereas Russia is quite clearly trying to interfere. It quite clearly wants to control the entire foreign policies of the Baltic nations. It quite clearly wants to destroy NATO. It wants to take away the primary defense instrument of 30 nations. We're not trying to do that to Russia. You know, Russia can carry on being a kleptocracy as far as we're concerned. You know, not our problem. But they want to interfere in us. So I think there is a big difference there. I think living your values in terms of there's certain things that we do defend, which are inherent in what we said. For instance, democracy. So a country that abandons democracy is a big problem for us, especially now. During the Cold War, we could get away with it to a degree because everyone understood there was an existential struggle between communism and democracy. So when a country like Greece was being ruled by the colonels, or when Turkey was having one of its phases when it was ruled by the generals, people kind of understood that. As they said, that's not good, but it's far more important to make sure that the Russian shock armies don't roll across the border. When the threat from other nations is much more value-driven, then the values of democracy become rather more important. So I think it is more important that we now live up to our values, and at least in certain core things. And I think if a NATO nation just decided it didn't want to do democracy anymore, I do think we have a big problem.
Right. Okay. Thank you. I made some notes during the process, so good. Thank you. Then I received some questions from the public, and let me start with the first one. Why did Russia betray and become hostile to NATO post-1991, despite aid and friendship extended?
Well, I think Russia's always been Russia, in the sense that doesn't mean that countries can't change. They do. But Russia has certain streams of history which mean that it has always been suspicious of outsiders. It believes in things like Mackinder's heartland theory and so on, which highlights where is the center of power and its need to control its periphery. Somewhat cynically, but somewhat genuinely, it genuinely believed that it needed to control Romania and Hungary and all the countries on its periphery in order to stop itself being invaded. Now, it's frankly absurd to imagine, the days when, massive army corps would rove across the Russian steppes are just gone. It's never going to happen anymore. But it's deep inside the Russian psyche that they have always been invaded, and therefore they need buffer zones. And they regarded the Warsaw Pact as a buffer zone to some degree. And they now take the same attitude to the nations around them. And I think you then go back to the Melian dialogues. When NATO enlarged to take in the former Warsaw Pact, it was not a threat to Russia. But if Russia had enlarged to take in NATO nations, it would have been a threat to us. So bullies always interpret the actions of others in light of their own psychology of being a bully. So if you're a good guy, you tend to interpret other people's actions in the nicest light. If you're a bully, you tend to interpret them in a nasty light. When NATO enlarged, many in Russia saw it as a threat, especially its traditional security institutions. You also had, I think, a profound disillusionment with capitalism because of the economic crisis that followed Yeltsin and the kleptocracy that built up and so on, to the point that they became very disillusioned. You know, they thought there was a point, I think, that if they had managed the transition when things might have been managed better. But I think everything that happened to them made them rush back to the big man, which became Putin. Putin is what Putin has always been. I frankly don't believe he was ever going to be anything different. I think the idea that somehow we did something that changed his mind is just rubbish. You know, you don't go from being a KGB colonel and then end up as the world's richest man through stuff you don't announce. And the man is as crooked as they come. He didn't decide, oh, the West was nasty to me, I think I'll become a crook and enrich myself. Honest people don't become dishonest like that at his age. So I think to some degree what we saw was always going to happen, but there were missteps. And I think the chaos of the Russian transition from communism to crony capitalism was probably the biggest key factor.
Right, thank you. Then the second question. Post-1991, hardcore communists have left Russia, and so did East Germans. In your view, the illegal network posing a threat to our democracies, and what should Allied governments do?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's some very hard issues here. And I think the same applies to China. And I come from, and you know, I'm British. And what we have done is that we have been prepared to look the other way on letting very rich people who acquired their money through a kleptocracy to, in effect, laundry it in our countries. And they put the money, they bought football clubs, they bought companies, they've invested in things. And we've let our short-term view overwhelm our long-term values. It's very, very easy. It's a slippery slope. And, you know, you've seen some of the people who've fallen victim to this, is that we've accepted the Russian silver and it has corrupted us. And I think the answer is, are we gutsy enough? Are we brave enough to harm ourselves to avoid a greater harm in the future? Because I make no doubt that the flood of Russian money has corrupted our institutions. And, you know, as people said, oh, if we have the children of Russian oligarchs come to our wonderful private schools, we will civilize them. No. The children of the oligarchs have come and said, well, daddy's illegally gotten money has gotten me to the best school in the world. So illegally gotten money, yowza, I'm up for that. And at the same time, the school they've gone to has said, oh my God, if they didn't come to my school, we'd go broke. So a lot of Chinese money, a lot of Russian money, legal money toxifies. And our societies have become corrupted to a greater or lesser extent. How do you take that out? With great difficulty. And it will hurt us. Now, the Russians are not as big a problem as the Chinese. we're now in a position of, can we afford to be moral with the Chinese? And that depends how much value you put on morality and how much value you put on money.
Yeah, interesting. Okay, so then the last question. Russia established the Asia Pole, an antithesis or Russian version of Interpol. How does this organization play into Russian hybrid strategy?
Well, I'm not a specific expert on that particular aspect. What I would say is that nothing that Russia does is independent of Kremlin control or Kremlin influence. Nothing. So anything which appears to be independent isn't. And it's the same thing with China. Yeah, people have got to get real about this. A Russian oligarch who brings their money over, unless they get all of their money out, all of their family out, and live in whichever country completely, is always influenced by the Kremlin. There was always somebody who will yank their chain. Now, they may have a degree of influence, a degree of freedom, but in the end, they know which side their bread is buttered. So it doesn't mean that there isn't good value in some of the things that people do. You know, it doesn't mean that Russia's Sputnik vaccine, you know, doesn't work. Though it'd be nice if they gave a bit more information on it. It doesn't mean that it doesn't mean that their aircraft don't fly. But you have to remember is if the Russians want to use it for that purpose, they will. So it's a question really of control. So things like the Asia Pole, I don't know enough about it. It might well have value, but at any point along the line, if the Kremlin says we need it to do this, it will do this. There's no such thing as real independence in Russia, and even less so in China. So what's they say about supping, you know, if you want to sup with the devil, you need a long spoon. I'm sorry if that sounds harsh, but, you know, we live in the world of the new great game.
Right. Okay, so there were the questions that I've got. I don't have any more questions. I think this will be the end of this session. I'm looking at Geoffrey, if he has something to say. That's okay. Okay, so I would like to thank you so much for your time and effort. And I learned new things, so that's good. And I think the rest of the people who watched probably learned new things too. Thank you so much. Have a nice weekend, I guess.
Thank you. And thank you everyone for listening. Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Okay.